So today I'll be talking about why some contracts can't be competitive. I was talking to a friend the other day who is doing economics A-level as well, and he was talking about, or we were talking about, the corporate mechanisms for competition. Now clearly, we're both incredibly normal people. We were talking about corporate mechanisms for competition, and I was talking about the defence market, how it differs, the means by which they do it most efficiently. And we sort of tried to clarify things. He thought that all defence contracts were competitive, in a way mirrored by the free market organised by the government. And I said, well, to an extent, different firms have to go through required pre-qualification. They have to submit proposals and follow government protocol, so it's not quite normal. But importantly, not all contracts are competitive. And he was rather disgruntled by this. He claimed that the government, which prides itself on meritocracy in this process, shouldn't be hiding the fact that they're sneakily giving out contracts in a corrupt manner. And I stopped him and said, first off, there is no corruption within this process. One can be assured of that because it is ridiculously rigorous. But additionally, I asked him whether he could build the submarine. And if you question why some contracts are non-competitive, I would ask you the same thing. So let me explain. It's a common misconception that all defence contracts are competitive. There are some that are non-competitive, a reasonable chunk of spending. Now the government doesn't hide this. They're not, sneakily doing it, as this gentleman said. And I'll leave a link to the open information page where you can see the entire financial breakdown by the government, by the MOD itself. Anyway, the first thing to realise is that while it isn't technically meritocratic, in the strictest sense of the word, it is necessary. And the process, while it is meritocratic in a general sense, it's not technically meritocratic because not every contract is open to everyone. The MOD does operate upon the basis of meritocracy, even in some instances, though it favours small to medium enterprise. Yet, to so many, it doesn't make sense why some contracts aren't competitive. And it's sort of a fairly simple answer, which I gave my friend, and it's that not every entity has the ability to give the government what it wants. Now, if we're to look at certain contracts, I may be wrong about this, but I believe Dreadnought, the Dreadnought class of submarine, the programme, if we look at the contract, I don't think it's competitive. Maybe I'm wrong. But it is something of vital importance. The smaller firms cannot make it. The sort of firms that need to be used in this are larger firms. It needs to be put in the hands of larger firms in order to be a successful programme. Now, this may mean that the contract is reduced in the number of competitors. For example, for the Type 32 competition, the Type 32 contract, while the process is meritocratic, there are still requirements. I cannot, nor can Budgens up the high street, have the wherewithal to build a load of new warships. So the contract competition will only be extended to a few firms, which can pass pre-qualification. Now, when we look at some projects, there are no competitors that can do the job than the one monopoly firm. And that, in the UK, is probably BAE Systems. And that's not such a bad thing. To build the Dreadnought submarine, for example, one would need to employ tens of thousands of people with different abilities, have the financial ability to construct and contract for the ship itself, have the physical areas by which to build such systems, and all of that requires a lot of logistics. The fact of the matter is, I, nor Budgens up the high street, we don't have a British-based shipyard. BAE Systems does, or at least Budgens doesn't have one that we know about. In any certain situation, there are only a few, for the larger projects, a few firms that can actually carry out the order. And this isn't because it's not meritocratic. They're not excluding certain firms from joining, but they are making it non-competitive because only certain firms have capabilities, only certain firms have the required, built-up facilities with the government, the built-up relationship. And if there's one right firm for the job, then some contracts cannot be competitive. Now, the MOD sets this out clearly, as I say. They're not being sneaky. In the year 2020 to 2021, 42% of the contract spent, the money spent on the contract, went to competitive ventures. 34% of the money did not. it went to non-competitive ventures, and then the rest was in, the other category. And in the same year, of course, the highest expenditure projects were Britain's development of Lightning II, Dreadnought, the astute boats 4 to 7, and our Queen Elizabeth class carriers. So what we can say from this is that a lot of the above, probably all of the above, were likely far less competitive, if not entirely non-competitive. Likely the final three were entirely non-competitive, or really, really restricted, because not every firm, there are barely any firms on the planet, let alone in the UK, that have the proper facilities to build Dreadnought, to build or fix the astute boats 4 to 7, upgrade them, to maintain, to build the Queen Elizabeth class carriers. There's a very certain set of things you have to have. As I say, you have to have a shipyard, and that's not something that all firms have. You have to have the employees, you have to have the logistical power, you have to have the finance to back it up. It's a very rigorous process, and only few firms can get through this really, really rigorous process. And I think that likely people need to realise, rather than criticise, that certain firms, generally larger firms, have sole capability to do these sort of large projects. They're simply not achievable by SMEs, and so the criteria that they're judged by it has a higher threshold for entry, really. The criticism of limited competition, or the total lack thereof, isn't necessarily arguing against a lack of meritocracy, but rather the state of the world as it is. That is, that certain firms have things, certain things do not. Additionally, there is another reason by which firms might be chosen for limited competitions, and it goes beyond just capability. First off, for larger defence firms, like in the UK we have BAE Systems, for example, the government has a certain control over how they're run, and this comes in really two facets. The business itself and the MOD are intertwined. They have a lot of operations together. BAE relies on the government for, a real sizable portion of its sales, of its interaction. BAE has a lot of intertwined infrastructure with the MOD, with the British defence sector in general, and so obviously they have to maintain stuff. And this is important for large monolithic contracts, which fall under the non-competitive criteria, because for those to be actualised and done in an efficient manner, not only do you have to have the facilities, but you have to have the built-up logistical connections with the MOD. And that's a really important thing. And if there is no prospect of you building up those logistical connections, then it's not a positive thing for the UK government to allow you to participate in that contract. Now, if we're talking about another reason, to keep with the example of BAE, the government holds the golden share, which is, it's sort of a share that means it can outvote anyone in certain decisions under specific criteria. The point is, it has certain control over the, way the firm operates. The same control it doesn't have over smaller firms, and that's a really important thing, because it means that the government can largely dictate how these projects go, and it can really keep certain large firms to its standards. And that's really important. Considering these firms can be far more stable when contracted for larger projects is a very positive thing. Now also, the firms make a lot of other infrastructure, meaning deals are sweetened by the fact that there are more synergetic technologies. Certain munitions line up with certain vehicles. Certain upgrade packages might be desirable by one particular bidder, and that is something that's included in the contract proposal itself. Now, finally, I guess, these larger firms are keen on acquisition. If they see a firm that's doing things right, doing things in a manner that's more efficient than them, then they will probably look to acquire, and that obviously does reduce the number of firms on the market. Now, there are certain, these firms don't generally agree to change that much. They don't agree to be engulfed by a large bureaucratic mass. But nonetheless, it does become part of the same entity, as it were. Meaning they end up, the larger firm, the acquirer, as one of, if not the only option through subsidiary firms even, if those firms are contracted. All in all, people criticise the idea that government contracts might not be competitive or might not be fully meritocratic, but what they forget is that pre-qualification, it relies upon certain criteria, certain conditions to be filled. In scenarios where other firms cannot fulfil those conditions, then only a few can, or one firm can, and that is the firm, or those are the firms that will compete, or that is the firm that will take the contract, de facto. It works as a mechanism in a similar way to other contracts where people are screened out by the conditions of pre-qualification, like every other contract. It's not against meritocracy, but it is on the basis of meritocracy, but also specific criteria. And people criticise this a lot, but the fact of the matter is, it applies to plenty of other firms outside of the industry as well. If any other firm within the free market were to act in this manner, people wouldn't have a problem. If a big construction firm needed a load of bricks, let's say, or excavators, then it would only really consider, and could only consider, buying from larger suppliers with that capability. And that is the idea of pre-qualification. The point overall, and I'm kind of mincing this, but the point is that the MOD is transparent. The MOD processes are meritocratic but specific. They have to have criteria, obviously. And defence firms that operate within this meritocratic system are good in themselves. They're not cheating the system. You can't criticise firms for being bigger, having more capability than other firms they're competing with. So, non-competitive contracts are legitimate.